Hello everyone. Today's topic is History of Inclusive Education. As we know, there have always been special needs children, but there have not always been educational programs to meet their needs. It is therefore important to give some thoughts to the historical perspective of educational programs for special needs children. Let's see how it developed in the ancient to modern age. First, look at global scenario. It is distributed in different areas like the era of exclusion, the era of acceptance, the era of legal discrimination, the era of sympathy and asylum, the era of segregated settings, the era of integrated settings, and the era of inclusive settings. Let's see the fact and happenings related to the history of children with disability under the above heads. First, on a global basis. Number 1, the era of exclusion. The earlier history of treating disability is almost dominated by the philosophy of exclusion. That is, totally excluding and exterminating the disabled from the mainstream of the general population through the quite horrified measures like killing, mutilating, burning, exiling, abandoning or making them vanish from the scene somehow or the other. Such practices were in vogue throughout the globe in almost all the ancient civilization of the world. Particularly in Egypt, Greek and Rome, disabled babies were killed because they were considered to be imperfect. The guiding principle was nothing imperfect should be brought up. Second one is the era of acceptance. In this era, many of the disabled children begin to be utilized as commodities for serving as beggars, prostitutes, and slaves. Many mentally retarded were usually sold as slaves, taken for beggars, or sometimes deliberately maimed to add to their value as objects of charity. Similarly, blind and hearing impaired were also utilized for such purpose, besides being pushed into prostitution. Next one is the era of legal discrimination. During Middle Age, the rise of deep religious convictions throughout the world produced some humanitarian care for the retarded, mentally ill, and physically handicapped. The threat to survival of disabled children decreased, but the mentally ill were considered to be possessed by evil spirits. Mental or physical abnormalities were considered to be the result of anger of God or the divine punishment for a sin. In this way, people tried to label disabilities as a whole as impurities, disqualifying their bearers from active participation in the cult and even went for their social isolation by declaring that the slow-witted, the fools, the silly, the mad, the blind, the crippled, the lame, the deaf, the underage, none of these shall enter the bosom of the community, for the holy angels dwells in its midst. And next one is the era of sympathy and asylum. With the advent of the second phase of the Christian era, attempts were in vogue to stop the abuse of the disabled children. Disabled children were now regarded as those poor souls who have been denied opportunities to lead a normal life on account of the annoyance of the Almighty for committing sins. They were now a subject of sympathy. In 1829, the New England Asylum for the Education of the Blind was founded in Watertown, Massachusetts. The fifth one is the era of segregated settings. The Renaissance movement originated from Italy in the 16th century and then spread throughout the Western world in the 17th century, brought a new era of hope to the disabled population. Benjamin Rush, he is a physician in the late 1700s, was one of the first Americans to introduce the idea of educating persons with disabilities. Ettard, a French physician, was the originator of instructional devices, the inventor of behavioral modification techniques, the first speech therapist, creator of oral education of the deaf, the father of special education for the mentally retarded and the physically handicapped. His work with Victor, a wild boy of 11 to 12, established the idea that the retarded could learn and improve. As per the Encyclopedia of Special Education, the establishment of special education began in 1832 with the first school for the deaf in Kentucky. The first college for the deaf was started in 1857 in Columbia. In 1896, Rhode Island began education classes for individuals with mental retardation. Next, the era of integrative settings. During the 1950s and 1960s, parents' organization in the USA initiated advocacy actions for education of their children with disabilities. A group of special education leaders began advocating for the rights of students with disabilities to learn in a more normalized school environment with their peers. During this period, a large number of special educators were exploring the possibilities of integrating children with disabilities into the regular classrooms. For example, Klaus Weddell was encouraging hearing impaired children from a segregated unit in England to join in mainstream classroom activities. Similarly, Peter Mittler was working to integrate children with autistic spectrum disorder from a hospital setting into mainstream primary schools in England in the early 1960s. These two examples indicate that special educators were thinking towards integration before the terms was coined. In the early part of 1970s, various court decisions in USA established the right of all children labeled as mentally retarded to free and appropriate education. Pressure by parents, court, and legislators resulted in the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which was enacted in 1978. This law reauthorized as the Individuals with Disabilities Education of 1990s extended the right to a free public education to all children, regardless of disability, in the least restrictive environment possible. Last one is the Era of inclusive settings. The era of inclusive settings, that is, educating all types of children, whether exceptional or normal, together in the regular classroom of the mainstream school represents the modern era and the latest development in the history of special education. The beginning of this era may be traced to as far back as the 1970s with the evaporation of the positives surrounding the era of integrated settings of the special classes. Many of the educationists, teachers, and parents were found to air their views against the segregated classes operating within the regular schools. At last, we can conclude that the education of disabled children all over the world has surpassed many significant phases in its traveling from the era of neglect and isolated institution or special school settings to the present era governed by the requirements and demands of the provision of inclusive education for beginning all types of disabled in mainstream in the true spirit of providing equal opportunities. In this way, we have seen brief history of inclusive education. Thanks for watching.